All right. I think we're a couple of minutes after the hour, so maybe we should get going.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, I suggest that we start the session on Global Open Research Commons, model adoption, and next steps, as you can read from the slide. So, on behalf of the co-chairs of the GORG Interest Group and GORG Working Group, I would like to welcome you all to this session. I would like especially to thank all of you that have contributed to defining it and that will participate in it. We have a number of guest speakers in this session, like Martin, Philippe, and who else? And Walmart, I believe. And yeah, essentially, in a few words, with this introduction, I would like to a little bit present the scope or what we had in mind for the session. You will see, of course, all the details later on as we go into the discussion. But over the last three years, I would say, or even longer, in this interest group and working group, we ask ourselves the question on how to facilitate cooperation, or if you want to use the word interoperability, with each of these too technical, but essentially it's about cooperation among infrastructures for data and for open science at a global scale. This is a very big question, and I think we have made quite some good progress. Later on, CJ will explain what are the outcomes of these two groups to date. And of course, we started with reflections of very high level. No? Well, first of all, what are commons? Do we have a common understanding of what commons are or not? What are the main elements characterizing a common, or that ideally should be part of any commons? As a result of that, we produce an output, which is the typology of fundamental elements in a common, which is like a very high-level characterization of what the infrastructure for data or other research digital objects, not only data necessarily, should include. And from there, we took a deeper dive into these essential elements, which include things like governance. Well, CJ will show the picture later on. Some basic elements like governance, computing, services, engagement, all these kind of things. We try to be a little bit more precise and try to define a roadmap, if you will, by describing a little bit more in more detail what could be these features or these attributes of these commons. Mainly as a guidance or as a supporting tool for common developers or for communities that are structuring their data or their resources around an open research commons. As a result of that, we published the GORG International Model, which is available to all of you, and that is the result of the efforts of many people. This is maybe a good moment also to thank everyone that got involved in that. There were many discussions and many people contributing to it. And well, we published it towards the end of the last year. I think it was well received by the community. I think that there was not an equivalent effort at that scale to actually provide a roadmap or to identify the essential attributes and features of the commons. We are very happy that some of you and some organizations have taken interest in the model, and they are looking into it or scrutinizing it and even using it a little bit, or they are finding it useful to guide their own reflections and their own strategies about how to develop their own system, their own infrastructures. So that is a little bit the point at which we are. We have been sharing this model as widely as possible with all of you. There's been some positive feedback, and in this session, we would like to go a little bit more in detail. We will be listening later on from what we call adopters. These are representative of organizations that have found the model useful to some extent, and they will let us know how exactly. But of course, the model also has some limitations, or it can be completed in different forms, and that is also something we are very much interested in listening your opinions. I mean, how this interest group and working group could extend its work, how it could be more useful to the community, and what should be the main strategy to, going back to our original mission, to facilitate cooperation at a global scale for research commons. So that is a little bit how we see it. We will introduce, and now CJ will do that. He will present the main outcomes of the interest and working group. And then we will move on to the presentations by what we call adopters. And then we hope to have a very good discussions about how to improve it, how to extend it, what else can we do, and to organize a little bit our thinking for the future. So yeah, with these words, I'm thanking again very much everyone involved in the session and in producing the Work International model. I give the floor for CJ to continue with the presentation. Oh, by the way, I have to say first, I have been saying the word commons many times, but some of you may not be very familiar with exactly what we are discussing here. So we have a Menti. Can someone move to the next slide, please, where the presentation of the Menti is and the questions? Okay, so the agenda, we can go back to it maybe later on, but we invite you to go to the Menti. You have the code here, and we have a number of questions that we would appreciate if you reply to them, so we get a little bit of a better understanding of who you are, what your interest may be, what is your degree of knowledge of this topic, etc., etc. So now, yeah, with this, I give the floor back to CJ. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Javier. And so again, just echoing Javier, thank you for joining, folks. We do really appreciate you being here. We're hoping to get a lot out of this discussion, especially with the presentation of model adopters. So this Menti is really to see who's in the room. These are the questions that are in the Menti, and I'll flip over there in a second once people start filling it out. Just to give you a visual representation of the agenda too, as Javier alluded to, we're going to talk a little bit about previous work. We're going to talk a little bit about what the outputs are themselves. Javier gave a great overview, but we'll give you some visuals too. And then we're going to move into lightning talks from our adopters. We're going to have a panel discussion, and then we're going to talk about what comes next. All right, so let's have a look at this Menti. Have you heard of it before? And someone's not sure or no. Okay, that's totally fine. So those of you that have not heard of it before, we are going to be talking about what exactly it is and what are the outputs that we have, as well as what future work looks like. So you will have heard of us and you will hopefully completely understand by the end of the session. Go to the next one. Which country are you from? United Kingdom, France, Netherlands. Okay, those are not surprising given the number of people I recognize in the call. Okay, strong representation from Netherlands and France. That's excellent. South Korea, South Africa, Sweden, Norway, Belgium, Australia. Wow, isn't it like the middle of the night in Australia? Props. Thank you for being here. Thumbs up. Yeah. Excellent. The United States, Finland. Wow. Okay, so we've got some great Slovenia. Wow. All right. So we've got some really good representation in the audience today. So thank you so much for being here, especially those of you where this is not a convenient time. That's extra excellent. And I really hope that we can get you engaged in the discussion, even though you might be up in the middle of the night. So that looks stable. We'll move to the next question. What sort of organization are you from? And so we've got a limited number of options here: funder, research institute, university, service provider, or other. Oh wow, lots of them coming in already. Great. And so if you selected other, if you feel comfortable entering in the chat, what other means for you, I'd love to know what other organization type you're representing. Only if you feel comfortable, of course. No pressure. RDA France. Thank you, Francois. That is definitely another kind of organization. That's not a service provider or a research institute or university. Appreciate it. And the Research Software Alliance. Okay. So maybe we need to have something else in here around like global collaborative bodies, or even regional collaborative bodies for that matter, thinking of RDA France. So that's really interesting. So a lot of people coming from the research institute or university space, the service provider space. Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. Very cool. So yeah, that definitely would be, it sounds like all the ones that are other kind of fall into this collaborative working collaborations. Words are great. So we'll move on from this question. Thank you for those that filled it out. To what do you think of when you hear we're all alliances? Thank you, Michelle. What do you think of when you hear the word commons? And so this is going to be a word cloud. So you can I think you might be limited in the number of characters you can use, but it's really whatever comes to mind first, that first phrase or that first word that you might think of. Connecting, sharing. Those are good. Those are good words. Shared infrastructure, clouds, common goods. We were having a discussion on that just now. I feel like I know who entered that one. Community. Oh, wow. Okay. So lots standards. That's a really interesting one. Okay. Public. But yeah, community and sharing definitely have some strong ones. And then we've got sharing here as well that kind of encapsulated in slightly different or more specific ideas like shared infrastructure. And sharing is also here, but with an extra E. Exchange. Great. Okay. And then lastly on here, and this is really small. That's too bad. Can I make it bigger? I don't think so. Which areas are you interested in learning more about? So I hope on your version of the Menti they're a little bit larger. I can see them, so I'll read them out as we see, but this is going to be a ranked choice. So we've got a number of things that we can do with the model or do with the outputs in the future. And we're kind of interested to see what are people interested in what happens next. And Javier has helpfully put the definition of a commons in the chat: a global trusted ecosystem that provides seamless access to high quality interoperable research outputs and services. So there you go, in case you needed a definition. So some of the things we're thinking of for areas and learning more about and where we want to move the model next is revising it, adoption support and feedback, additional analysis and publications from the version 1 work. And so that included things that didn't make it out in our first supporting outputs, like commons types, a speaker series analysis, and cross-cutting themes. We want to map with relevant frameworks, including some RDA outputs. We want to work on visualization and graphics, as well as alternative formats. And there's been lots of discussion in other sessions, not just ours, but with colleagues in other groups on how we might be able to do that. Groups that have a really, really good, wow, nice, that have had really good success with visualization. We see them moving around. People are doing it. Okay. Maturity models is reaching the top. I didn't even get to that one, but that's all good. Expanding the scope to research hardware and physical tools is also doing some pretty good stuff up there. We also were talking about implementation maps, which is how do you implement the consideration in the model? Ooh, this is really interesting. Okay. So adoption support is high, visualization is high, but we're seeing a lot of shifting. Right, I'm going to give that another minute or two because I think this is a really interesting point. All right, I'm going to leave this one up so that it stays available for those that are maybe joining late or want a little bit more time to think about it. But we're going to switch back to the slides so that we can move on into our showcasing of the outputs, and then we'll come back to what do you want to learn about more at the end of it so that we can focus that discussion as well, just in the interest of time. Yeah, and Francois has a good point. You will have to explain maturity model for a model which is not prescriptive. I definitely hear you, Francois. I use the word maturity model just because that's the way that it tends to be said. I felt like that was the easiest way to get the point across. But thinking about the consideration of you either have it or you don't have it is maybe a two binary. So there might be levels of adoption for each individual item that might be easier. And that's a dangerous slope. I definitely hear that. But that's part of the discussion on how we might address it and what's the best way to talk about it. So let's actually talk about what we mean by global open research commons first. And so Javier gave most of the overview. So I'll just go through the visualization quite quickly here because we want to jump into our adoption stories. So the idea of the global open research commons is a interconnection of research commons on a global level. And the idea essentially would be that we would have the availability to researchers of research artifacts everywhere to everyone at all times with the right protocol and procedures in place. So we're looking at interoperability and FAIR big time when we're talking about this global open research commons. And so the interest group, their goal was to have a neutral space where commons or folks that were creating research infrastructure could come to discuss how you might accomplish that interconnection of research infrastructures and how do you get there. That's what the roadmap is supposed to be for. And the roadmap is still under construction. It's not an output that's available yet. And as part of getting to that roadmap, it was not just how do you do it, but what do you need to consider? And that's where the Global Open Research Commons International Model Working Group came in. So the model is a non-prescriptive model to say these are the considerations a research commons or research infrastructure, research cloud might have as it's being built or expanded if they want to be part of something like a GORC, where they can interoperate with other research commons and have research artifacts or services that are shared. And so this model informs the roadmap. And the idea is that together they'll lead towards this interconnection on a global scale of research infrastructures. And so as Javier said, there was the interest groups supporting outputs, and this is a visualization of those essential elements that the interest group defined. The idea with the essential elements is that every commons would need to have something in each element, but what you have and how you implement it is going to be specific to your context. So the model is built underneath these essential elements, and it gives you a lot more finer detail around them. And we use this as a foundation for the model. I will say quickly here, Andrew has many things to say about this as he did in the first session, but the short form is that the IG didn't just output a diagram, it was a whole report with very specific definitions to capture what they meant for each individual item. The idea is that the white hexagons are human elements that kind of address the underlying you might say soft or human aspects of your commons, like governance structures, engagement, sustainability, rules of participation, access, and human capacity. And then you've got your technical pieces that are kind of what people go to when they think of a commons, what researchers or users might interact with directly, like your ICT infrastructure, compute, storage, network, and authorization and authentication infrastructure, research objects and services and tools. At the center of everything, however, is this key or core item of interoperability, standards, and conventions. So with the typology, that informed the model, and then likewise, the model informed the typology as it went. These were in kind of in lockstep as they were being developed. The typology was endorsed in July of 2023, and then we continued with the model. So we had 12 speakers, some of whom are here today, so thank you for attending. We did a literature review, and then we went through a revision of the model iteratively with our working group and 6 dedicated task groups. This also generated a report on our methodology, the literature review, and a fuller analysis of the model itself in a narrative format. And these were endorsed at International Data Week 2023, which was this last October. We also had 28 working group meetings. So the model is non-prescriptive guide for stakeholders, as Francoise has pointed out in the chat. It's not prescriptive. We're not telling you what to do. We're saying this is what you need to consider, and then your context will determine which ones you adopt and how. It's in a spreadsheet container organized by the essential elements, but it's broken down into finer granularity of categories and subcategories, each of which has attributes and features as characteristics. There's extended descriptions, examples, and sources, as well as consideration levels on each item and a glossary, plus key performance indicators and metrics that you can use to measure success or to get you started on what metrics might make sense for you. The report is more so background information, the detailed methodology, a narrative summary, and the current intended use of the model, as well as areas of future work. So that was future work as we thought of them in October of last year. We now actually have more areas of future work, as you saw in our ranked list on Menti. I've kind of touched on this already. The model has entities, essential elements, categories, and subcategories, and characteristics of attributes and features. The idea is that characteristics can be inherited from parent to child. So if an essential element has a characteristic of an attribute, maybe that attribute has a feature. If that essential element also has a category, which most of them do, it'll inherit the characteristics, and likewise with the subcategories, it'll inherit those characteristics. This is what it looks like in the spreadsheet format. If you're looking at the slides, if you click the image of the spreadsheet, it'll open the spreadsheet itself in Google Docs or Google Spreadsheets, and the Google spreadsheet is open for comments. So if you want to take a look at the model later on, maybe in more detail, or you've got some feedback that you want to give, please feel free to leave comments on it or email me directly. My contact information is actually embedded in that document too, because we are going to be looking at model revisions and new versions of the model full on later on. All right, takeaways. Everyone loves the diagram, the hexagon diagram. You're going to see that a lot in the adoption stories too. The vocabulary is useful, and it's actually being used by RDA right now for some of their back end catalogs, and we're working with RDA on how to use that more fully. The implementation of the model and maturity levels are needed. So again, thinking about Francois's point around a maturity model on a model that's not prescriptive might not make sense. Another way we might say that is maturity level, but that is something that we've seen mentioned more than once, is that having a binary, yes, we have it, or no, we don't, is maybe not sufficient for what the model wants to address. And then working examples or profiles of the model are also needed. So those are our main takeaways. And next we'll hear about adoption stories. So we're going to order this in reverse order of how I'm presenting it. So we're hearing from Volmar, who's representing Elixir. We're hearing from Martin, who's representing Surf, but Laurence is also here. And we are going to be watching a video that's done by Philip and Rory. Philip is here to be part of the panel, and Rory will hopefully be joining shortly too to be part of the panel. So we're going to start with the video from Philip and Rory, then we'll move on to Martin, who will present his own slides, and lastly, Volmar, who will present his own slides as well.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. My name is Philip.
And I'm Rory.
So thank you all for inviting us to present our adoption story of the GORC model. This presentation has 3 short sections. I will start off telling you a little bit about what we actually did with the GORC model, and then I'll continue in the section 2, presenting briefly what we found helpful with the model, and then Rory will finishing up this, presenting what kind of issues we encountered with the model, using the model. So let's start with the first section. What did we actually do with the GORC model? So basically, we used the GORC model as a reference model or framework for a major grant proposal that we submitted last November last year to the Research Council of Norway for funding to establish Research Commons for Norway, or in short, REASON. And REASON is a proposed generalist research infrastructure for Norway, which complements and supplements domain-specific and other specialized infrastructures, and which also includes the 9 essential elements of the GORC model. This proposal is now under evaluation, and we will be notified of the outcome in November this year. So let's move on to the second section. Where did we find the GORC model useful for our work? Well, the most crucial point to make here is that without using the GORC model as the essential reference model or framework, we couldn't have submitted our proposal, because we ended up with a very limited amount of time at the end. And using the GORC model as a reference model was very useful to us. And also, in our view, the availability of the GORC model provides, for the first time, a globally accepted template for Research Commons. And also, Research Commons are now increasingly seen as the best internationally recognized model for delivery of integrated research services. And together, this meant that we were able to demonstrate that our proposal, or our proposed infrastructure, is aligned with a larger international approach to establish and operate interoperable research infrastructures. And on a more detailed level, of course, the GORC model provided us with a lot of useful information and guidance on how to establish the different elements that are necessary in a Research Commons. And with that, I hand over to Rory.
Yes, so first, just to echo what Philip said, the GORC model was really, it was the excuse, the environment, the context, as well as the model for everything that we did. So without the GORC model, the project wouldn't have happened. So in pointing out some issues that we encountered, I'm not at all meaning to be critical, just the opposite, and hoping to maybe think about some things which could be improved as the GORC model continues to evolve. So just to highlight 3 things. First of all, there's obviously variation in how well described the different elements are in the high-level description. That in itself is okay. In some cases, there was almost too much detail. And in particular, when you look at it's a huge task to do, as we did, to put together an actual full proposal for a fully featured GORC. And in some cases, the extensive detail can be a bit overwhelming. Second, the interaction between three of the technical elements, i.e. storage, compute, networking, on the one hand, services and tools, and interoperability, it seems to us to be a critical component of a working GORC. But this interaction is not very well covered in version 1 of the model, so something to think about going forward. And third, and this is also pretty fundamental, the model is a model, but it doesn't really take into account the need to get buy-in and support from multiple people and organizations if you're actually going to think about designing and implementing a GORC. And the reality is that in many cases, these organizations and people may have, in some cases, conflicting or even competing interests. And so the process of gathering together the support, the human support that's needed and the organizational support actually turned out to be quite messy. And we suspect this is likely to be the case in many cases. Not sure to what extent the model can account for this as a model, but it is something to think about, and possibly there could be some way of addressing this, or at least acknowledging it as the model is built going forward. So thank you very much. Yes, thanks very much.
Yeah, hopefully this is useful for the further discussion in this session. Thank you.
Okay, and so we'll move from here to Martin, who will present on behalf of SURF. And if you've got questions that are already percolating from Rory and Philip's presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat or directly in the collaborative notes, and we'll return to them after all of the presentations to do the panel discussion. So Martin, when you're ready, you can go ahead and share screen. There you go. Martin, you're muted.
Then you missed half my story.
Oh,
Thank
sorry.
you for inviting us to share our experience with the GORC model. My name is Maarten Hogewerf, working as an architect for SURF, a cooperative in the Netherlands for educational and research institutions. In this short presentation, I will explain some background, how we used GORC, what worked, and where we see opportunities for further work. So in the Netherlands, there's growing awareness for public values and digital commons in the Netherlands. A recent report from our national program on open science concluded that we have a rich but fragmented and confusing landscape, and that by forming a network as a commons, we can enhance coordination and connect better to the expertise and experience that is available in the European and international context. And in parallel, the Minister for Digitalization sent a letter to our parliament recommending that we should shape alternative technologies to reduce unwanted dependencies on non-values-driven providers for the big tech, and that digital commons offer a suitable model for this. Now we are preparing discussions how the Netherlands can connect to the EOSC Federation, the European Open Science Cloud, as one or more nodes. An important element of this preparation is to have an overview of what our rich but fragmented and confusing landscape looks like. And we agreed to start with a small inventory within SURF and a few colleague organizations to identify what we do, what the bottlenecks and opportunities are, and where we want to collaborate. And of course, we wanted to try the GORC model as a common language and see if this can help, in particular because we all want to stress that our infrastructures are also a lot more than just the technical facilities. It's also the human capacity, the training that people provide. So the initial inventory would be carried out via semi-structured dialogues using the GORC model. And for these dialogues, we wanted to discuss the categories and attributes behind the 9 elements. For that, we started to interpret and summarize the Excel sheet and this is something that we already started. And from these sort of summarizations, we also derived some easy-to-use questions to drive the dialogue. And I'm confident that these summarizations and questions may not be a perfect translation of everything that's behind the model, of course. So I should skip some slides. So these are just some hand-drafted summarizations, and then we derived some easy-to-use questions like, what is the common intent? What is the mandate of your initiative, etc. So these preparations really helped us to get familiar with much that is behind the model, and the dialogues were in general very pleasant. By just asking the participants to tell us about their activities, we could already fill in a lot of these essential elements. And then halfway the dialogue, we would turn it around and start to ask the more structured questions related to the 9 elements. And this part was really appreciated by the participants because it also raised a lot of aspects that they didn't consider yet. And all of the participants were really eager to know more about the GORK model. And here you also see a very short summarization of one of the dialogues. So the observations, what did we learn thanks to the GORK model? Well, that all the initiatives and participants recognized each of the 9 elements in their activities, that they share a common intent, though on different levels, ultimately to support research, to do the best possible research. We also learned that the blue technical hexagons need the white human social ones and vice versa. We learned that all the elements of the activities are interconnected. So for good training, you need to have knowledge for which you need human capacity, and you need to be engaged in state-of-the-art activities, etc. We also learned that all the initiatives share challenges with regards to engagement, sustainability, difficulties with their locally focused mandates, etc. And we learned that all the participants were or became enthusiastic about the GORK model and wanted to know a lot more about it. So what could have been better? The 9 elements are easily adopted, but hardly anyone dares to dive into the Excel behind it. And we should see how we can help people to access all the details behind the 9 elements. Related to that, really applying the GORK model takes some practice. For example, to define the scope in more complex organizations, or to deal with the 9 elements in less formal organizations. And I think this is also related to this question, how can we use some kind of a maturity model? Maybe it's not a maturity model, but we should really see how we can help more informal organizations to see that they also benefit from all these 9 elements. And that is all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Martin. Volmar, if you're ready, you can go ahead and share screen.
I am. So let's see. I think this should be the correct screen, full screen, right?
Yep, that
Are
looks
my
good to
slides
me.
showing? Perfect. So I'm presenting a ambition to adopt the GORK model. And we think about Elixir, which is a distributed infrastructure for Europe in general, but the case that we're starting from and my own connection is with the Swedish node in this infrastructure. So it's kind of a roadmap and a early inventory or impression of the GORK model. So the first case that we're going to look at, or that we are looking at, is using this to inform a renewed data management strategy locally at NBIS, which is the National Bioinformatics Infrastructure, where I'm working. And that's also the part of Elixir Sweden. And then Elixir Sweden is also part of the Swedish life science infrastructure, which is wider than bioinformatics, called SciLife Lab. And it's a complex ecosystem of different research infrastructures with different capabilities that would benefit, in my perspective, from having a coherent description and would make a good case for a commons. So there's a capability for precision medicine, and that precision medicine entry point could perhaps be a commons for that community. And then Elixir would be one of the providers there. And then we have Elixir as a whole, which is a very rich ecosystem. But each node is its own thing. There are many resources coming from many of the different nodes, and it also connects to other European infrastructure. And there might be some use cases for GORK or defining commons inside of this ecosystem to make it more easy for newcomers to the infrastructure. So the challenge here is that, I mean, I'm not really sure if we are a typical commons. It's really distributed networks of resources across all of these different adoption stories. So one of the challenges here is to basically recontextualize the GORK model to make sense to the people I'm talking to. I mean, all of the elements make sense. It's just not easy to pitch it when it's a distributed organization and you don't really have the top-down governance. And there's going to be variations depending on the use cases for the different communities. So, I mean, you might have a patchwork of commons if you want to use the model with kind of a single answer or a coherent answer to some of the questions. Just to give a very brief overview of the challenge, then I'm not going to go through all of the slides in detail. So Elixir has different platforms, and these platforms are used across different communities that Elixir targets. And these kind of consolidate services from across different platforms. And maybe a community could be a commons of resources aggregated from across Elixir. And then we would have several commons defined because we have many communities at different stages of maturity. And then we also have these projects that are building resources for certain research areas, like the European Joint Programme on Rare Diseases, that builds a virtual platform for querying and getting access to many different types of rare disease research and even clinical diagnosis. So it's a patchwork of having these communities within Elixir that we can serve, and then perhaps we can also target some of these project outputs and the kind of remaining infrastructures that are the result of the projects. Those could be perhaps commons or described using the GORK model. And then we have EOSC, which is on the European scale, an ambition to create something like a commons for research in general terms. So I think it would be useful for us to be able to describe some of our resources internally, to be able to benchmark and compare and contrast using the GORK model. And then it would be very useful if this could be something that's used in other infrastructures that are part of the EOSC ecosystem. So we can compare across Europe and then ideally across the entire world for the global aspect. And we have a similar situation in Sweden, where NBIS is part of different infrastructures and also hosts parts of other infrastructures and so forth. With these examples as a background and the challenges that I described with recontextualizing things to make sense to the people I'm talking to, I think something that I would like to see in the future is built-in support for some sort of profiles. So I can use my own terms when I'm talking about this and presenting it to my community members, and then have some sort of automated translation or localization adaptation to the GORK model as a common frame of reference. And then maybe have some examples of implementations of value-added services or resources. I mean, for example, if we want to use this to discover potential solutions for different parts of a commons, or it could also be a way of benchmarking or something like that to cross commons, compare and contrast. So setting up some sort of structure to do that automatically or aggregate learnings. So with that, that's my final slide. We have 3 ongoing adoption ambitions, and then some challenges that I've already discovered, and then we have some proposed future work.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Volmar, and everybody who was here to present today. We want to move now into a panel discussion with our adopters. So we're fortunate to have pretty much everybody. I think everybody. We've got Martin and Laurence from SURF. We've got Volmar from Elixir, who you just heard from. And then we're also fortunate to have Rory and Philip from representing Reason with us too. So even though we saw the video, they're both here to be part of the panel discussion. And so we've got some starter questions that we can start with, but I'd like to open it to everyone in the room today to see if we have any urgent questions or things that we'd like to start with on your side. Javier and I have talked a lot already, and so we want to make sure that we hear your voices too. So please feel free to put things in the chat or raise a Zoom hand. We'd love to start the panel discussion with something from the audience. Maybe while folks are thinking, I will say that Francois put a question in the chat right away, and I did answer it, but I'll say it out loud for those that maybe can't see the chat. We have enough adoption cases to go from supporting output to recommendation, and is that in the plans? And the answer is yes, that's very much in the plans. We'd love to have the model and or the typology. I think we need to discuss exactly what gets submitted and if we want to submit everything as recommendations in the future. But you technically only need 2 adoption stories. And so we've actually got 3 and maybe more, which is really exciting. So that's definitely in the plans. We'd love to see one or all of the supporting outputs turned into recommendations in the near future. And Tiger is helping us with that. So hopefully in the next few months. Oh, question from Michelle. Go ahead.
It's not really a question, but I thought I'd just break the ice and do a conversation starter. I really wanted to say congratulations to everyone involved, because I was lurked on some of the early discussions around Gork, and then I haven't looked at it for a long time, and it's just achieving amazing things. Fantastic to see you're at where you're at now, and that you've got great implementation stories. So I guess the only question I have is something further on the agenda, what's coming next. So I know you'll get to that later. So yeah, well done to you all.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And I think it's exciting because we have so much left to do as well. So we got a strong start here. And then as for anyone who's skipped forward in the slides, you'll see there's like a list of 11 things that we want to do next. And we have to pick 1 or 2, maybe 3 of those 11 things to what to do next. But if we don't have immediate questions from the audience, we do have some questions that were prepared by the co-chairs for our adopters that we can start with. So I'm just going to share my slides so that everyone can see the questions, and maybe that makes it a little more accessible too. But some of these were answered in some of the lightning talks, so you might be rehashing, but it would be good to know, what did you find is best or easiest to use about the model? And so any of our adopters feel free to jump in any order.
So maybe I can start with the obvious. The typology is great, and I mean, since it is appealing, it's a good conversation starter to dive into the details of the model. So it's great to have those 2 as a pair. And then I think the examples from the model are also a very nice thing to have when you start discussing the different categories and attributes.
I fully agree with that.
Yeah,
Maybe
me too. I think clearly the elements that you put together and the visualization of it is is really fantastic, and that it's really a good advertisement for the model. It kind of encourages people to dive into the detail, so that's a huge plus.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And we had today we had a discussion with national stakeholders regarding contribution from the Netherlands to EOSC nodes. And there you can see indeed that if you bring those people around the table and you talk, so we printed out this model. We also had some questions, and then it really helps the dialogue. So nearly everybody is included in this discussion. And so also people who provide training, who are more involved in the software elements. But then after that, and then still it's still a challenge. And then maybe what also Volmar had in his presentation, still there are people with different interests. So, and there are also other concerns involved in and to really bring the discussion towards how can everybody contribute to such a commons, because then you need to maybe give up some autonomy, and then the difficulties start, I think.
Can I just pick up on 2 points there, but both of which I would like to echo. So I think actually I didn't watch our video, but I think I said it in the video. One of the things which we encountered in Reason was exactly that. There are a lot of pre-existing infrastructures that are going to be relevant to building any commons, and that was made clear by and also in Volmar's comments. And those, so one issue is how which Volmar alluded to, is how do you match, how do you put together the commons, and how do you take elements from the commons and then make them fit and add value to existing infrastructures and vice versa. So there's a kind of a strategic or technical aspect to it. And the other thing which you just mentioned, Laurence, was the kind of the people side of it. Each of those pre-existing technical infrastructures or resources is going to have people involved, people who spend time supporting them, developing them, getting funding for them. And in order for a commons to work, you need to bring the people who are trying to put together a commons need to bring those people into the conversation and figure out, how they're going to all work together. So I think both of those things are critical aspects of moving beyond the model to actually thinking about implementing something.
So if I may, CJ.
Yeah, Javier, go ahead.
Yeah, so I understand that all of you felt like there is a bit of an abrupt transition as you move in from the typology, which is welcoming, nice, and engaging, to the model itself, which is too detailed, and you can very easily get lost and do not identify yourself in the model. Like from my position, either as a developer or as a policy officer, or what of these elements am I supposed to contribute to? So I gather a little bit from your reactions that maybe an intermediate step in between the typology and the model itself, or maybe an identification of roles. I mean, what kind of profiles, depending on your position, what kind of profiles are related or should contribute to each of the elements and features would be desirable, something that help the community and the different profiles in the community to orient themselves within the model. Is that something that you would find somehow useful, or it doesn't make any sense at all? Because I understand that the transition is sharp and abrupt. The model is a lot more detailed and arid than the typology is. The question is a little bit, how could we relatively easily facilitate that transition? That's a natural question for me.
So that ties a little bit into my reflections, I think, about needing some sort of contextualized version of the model. I'm not sure if you can have one intermediary step that would fit everyone. I mean, we have the report that kind of contextualizes the model and describes the connection to the typology. But I mean, it doesn't really describe the federated there are very few examples that would kind of easily link the federated structure in the world that I am in to the model. And I'm not sure if adding more to that report would really be useful. So perhaps, I mean, an alternative description, and perhaps a shorter one, would actually be what we would like to have, like a partner to the report or something, something that would motivate people to put in the effort and persist in the challenges that comes with interpreting the different categories. I mean, I am committed, but I have, every time I have pitched the model to my colleagues, and I mean, depending on their profession, I have needed to really work on where does it fit in for them. And I think we should probably try to consolidate some examples of scenarios where it can be useful and put that as kind of the first entry point to the model. And then people could perhaps read more in the report and look into the different parts of the spreadsheet.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the contextualization is certainly a challenge. What I wonder is there are different dimensions to contextualize. It can be the individual profile of the person approaching it, or it could be the infrastructure or the service provided profile, or etc., or the discipline profile. So that is why a little bit why I was asking what is the most required dimension to put the model in context. Thank you.
Volmar, but to pick up on your point, I think it also relates to the discussion we had in your session earlier on life kind of commons and life sciences infrastructures. I think I think we also need some examples, and once we have some examples of marrying the commons model to a pre-existing federated structure, or indeed even starting a commons from scratch, because even de novo commons are not going to incorporate everything. Obviously, everyone is going to be selective and going to be individualized. So after we get a few examples, we'll then be able to study the examples and see what people have chosen, what's working, what's not working. So it's a bit of chicken and egg. It's hard. The hardest point is actually getting started. And I think like what you're trying to do with SciLife Lab and in Sweden, assuming you're successful in a year's time. So I think actually the trying to implement it, the design and implementation is the early ones are going to be difficult. Naturally they are, because it's new ground. But once we get a few, then I think we'll be able to reflect and observe and make comparison and also on the process of how to do an integration as well. So we should, maybe I'm saying we should have, you know, we shouldn't have we should have fairly modest expectations, I think, for the next phase. And to me, a lot of the next phase should be not with, well, I agree that the model needs to continue to be refined, but in a way, to me, the most important thing is to get experience with trying to implement it and seeing how that goes, what's the process, and also getting some concrete examples which we can then work with and understand.
I might add on here that getting concrete examples, seeing what people implement and how, and the process in doing so is very much of interest. And it's something that we kind of started to do in the creation of the version 1.0. I had done an analysis on all of our speakers, but because it wasn't an official part of the output and we hadn't checked with our speakers before we made the publication, none of those examples actually made it out with the output. But for some of our adopters, and in particular with SURF, we did look a little bit at what I was able to find about EOSC, because EOSC was one of the speakers and they are a federated infrastructure. And I know that having the implementation of some items that I was able to find asynchronously about EOSC for some of those items was helpful. And so maybe that's part of what we can do as that intermediary step, is that we've already got data on 12 speakers and then possibly 3 adopters, depending if you want to share what you did more concretely, like line by line, if that's possible. We could have as many as 15 examples already. It would be work to go back through and make sure it's up to date, because some of the analysis that I did is now, approaching being a year old. And, all of our speakers have gone on and grown their commons and gone into different things and increased their documentation and all of that stuff. But maybe that's something we can do as that intermediate step that Javier is saying is we've got examples in the wings, but we need to update them, make sure that they're approved by the people that they're representing, and then actually get them disseminated in a reasonable way. So maybe not in a spreadsheet, but perhaps moving towards a knowledge graph where you can click in and look at the implementations and the examples therein, which is what we're thinking of doing with another GORC group that's ramping up around health data commons. Is that kind of in the area, Wilmer and Rory in particular, that you think might be helpful?
I think so, yeah. I think it's, as you say, there are existing commons, and some of the ones which made presentations I thought were, really, really fantastic. And some of them are actually very well, are very mature and well developed. So it's not as if there's no examples out there. Yes, I think that would be a useful exercise.
Maybe an additional view. I mean, it might be useful to also not only consider different types of commons, but also different types of people or users that might look at the framework. So, I mean, if some people from within the GORC or friends of the GORC people could then, describe their challenges with interpreting the model, and if there are kind of things that would be surprising or confusing to a certain group of people that would be see themselves as the target for any of these kind of typology elements. So, I mean, the HR aspects that were, or some of them that were listed under the human capacity part, then, I mean, that might be a different personnel category than myself. And then when I get to talk to that person, maybe I could, if we together as implementers and promoters of the model could go together and collect these experiences in some structured way, because I don't imagine that we would bring in these people into the GORC discussions directly.
I really like that, Wilmer. That's a good point. So as like an additional dimension almost on some of the items, or even larger, like the larger categories or even essential elements, to say who is a part of those conversations, or who should be part of those conversations when you're taking on those considerations. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think maybe you can then also kind of adopt the language you use, because for example, if you want to use the GORC model to convince your management to do something, to give you support, then I think we still experience that some of the people in the management, they're still not familiar with some of the concepts we use, some of the language we use when we talk about interoperability, infrastructure, fair data, and so on. So I think having this in mind would be also useful when trying to. I think Rory said in one of his slides, kind of sell it in, so to the people who make decisions.
Now that you mentioned the people that make decisions, I am more on the policy making side than in the implementation side. So precisely one thing that could be interesting, and this idea just crossed my mind, is to maybe better define the value or the impact of implementing the GORC model. I mean, some of you already mentioned things like, that the GORC contributes to the integration of research services. In some cases, in the case of distributed infrastructures or networks, if you want to call it, where you have a more or less a scattered set of contributors, by integrating them in a coherent way that is, of course, contributes in principle to efficiency and sustainability. Also, by having some sort of alignment or compatibility but with other infrastructures, you facilitate cooperation and the exchange of ideas, eventually services, etc. That is a little bit behind every distributed infrastructure at different scale, national, thematic, or European, as we are trying to do in Europe. So, I mean, there is something interesting that I think we could elaborate or build from the adoption cases to see whether we can substantiate a little bit this kind of arguments that are the kind of arguments that policymakers listen to many times when you want to do something. For instance, with Philippe and Rory, you have a proposal forward for the creation of a commons. I think that is the kind of arguments. I don't know if in your particular case, but that are appreciated at decision-maker levels.
I mean, regarding giving feedback also perhaps to the adoption cases, I think let's say that we had a structure for capturing some information along the journey. I mean, some structure at least to could help us look at what information might be interesting to document and then report back on. So that could be something that I mean, the challenges that we face or I face, that's something that I'm gonna add, of course, but there might be things that I just don't notice because I mean it's not my thing. I'm not really sensitive to those problems. And if someone else has already discovered that this should be something we try to assess, then I could tune myself to look at that as well. Like the policy aspects, for example, that's not my thing, even though I might need to pitch this model to the closest number of people, but maybe I can ask them for some help or guidance on how I should have pitched it to them based on your comment here.
I really like that, Fulmer. I think that maybe that's almost like a adoption toolkit, which so far with everyone that we've heard from today, it's been kind of like we gave you the model and we did very intensive like meetings one-on-one and then some group meetings and some presentations, and we're kind of saying we don't know how we want adoption of the model to go. It's kind of free form and you can figure out what works best for you. But maybe it makes more sense with your experiences and from Reason as well as Surf and Elixir to say, what did work, what didn't work, and then also think about all the different perspectives that you're coming to the table with, and then we can have those suggestions in there. Yeah, that would also help adoption pick up too, and that's not necessarily an intermediate layer like what Javier mentioned at the beginning, but it would definitely be a lot easier to jump in with, you know, a recommendation on how to approach adopting the model instead of just, here's the model in a spreadsheet format, go for it.
Yeah, I'd like also to follow up a little bit on what Javier just mentioned, because I think make explicit what can be expected benefits if you work together with different stakeholders on a commons. Because that is, I think, where we struggle maybe most with. And so the model helps us in setting up a dialogue, but people around the table where we talk and with on a high level, their interest is indeed not so much like, okay, if we go into the details, before they go into the details, they want to have a little bit of clue. Okay, if we give up some of our autonomy, and what do we gain with that? What are the benefits also for us as an organization? And I think that is still not really explicit. And so we have that implicit, but maybe that, I think that could be a good idea to make the benefits of working together and on all of these elements and make it interoperable with other research infrastructure commons. That could help, I think, us in the adaptation of the model, but also establishing a commons.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I would just add that rather than describing the expected benefits, the idea would be to demonstrated benefits from the adoption stories. That would be the ideal. So you can actually show something tangible I mean, what kind of efficiency gains you got, what kind of simplification you got by structuring or rethinking your services or your infrastructure along the lines of the work. Because I mean, I think it's clear that you need to talk to politicians, Laurence, every once in a while, because these arguments, or funders or things like that, these arguments are typically the first thing you discuss in pretty much any proposal.
I mean, we could do both, right? Like have an adoption toolkit or starter kit where the benefits are described, but then also have these profile examples where they're demonstrated too. I think, yeah, we're talking about maybe like two different concrete things, like a adoption starter kit, as well as examples of the profile that help you with adoption and showcase those benefits, but they're complementary and can be used in the same conversation. But I think we're talking about two different things.
I think it also comes back to picking up on Javier's comments. It comes back to Volmar's earlier suggestion about kind of thinking about personas. I mean, the benefits that, let's say, a funder might be interested in are probably different from they're looking at efficiency, cost, things like that. Whereas another critical group, which Volmar mentioned, which I think is really important, is providers of existing infrastructures, and their attitude might be, well, look, we're doing great. We have a great service, or we have a great whatever, and we don't really need you. Or how are you going to benefit us? In fact, you might threaten us because you're going to overlap with what we're doing. So to pitch the benefits to them is going to take a different conversation, probably a bit more technical. So I think this idea of who are we going to be talking to? Who are the key personas? And then figuring out how to pitch benefits to each of those personas would be really useful. And frankly, I mean, if you're starting a business, if you don't have a convincing case, no one's going to buy your product. And so kind of articulating the benefits of a service is a fundamental thing which anyone needs to do. And I think we're being encouraged to go down that path. So yeah. I think the easiest people to convince are the people who are already involved in research data management, because that's us in a way. But to me, the two key ones probably are because they're blockers. And if they don't buy in, it's not going to happen. Or number one, funders. And number two, people who are providing existing infrastructure, which is complementary or overlapping and competitive, depending on one's point of view. So those are probably the two, or there's certainly two key constituencies we need to think about.
Yeah, agreed.
I'm maybe a bit confused that should the model tell people why they should start a commons or a research cloud, or should the model just help them if they have decided to do so? So should the model tell people you should start a research cloud and you should all collaborate, or should people that want to collaborate apply the model to help them? Or am I the only one that's a bit confused?
Well, yeah, in principle, the model is a tool helping the implementation of research commons, a guidance or a roadmap, for the basic architecture from the high level to the more concrete elements. But I think that it can be inspiring in different directions. So it's not only necessarily directly oriented to application or deployment. I mean, we are proposing something. And the question a little bit, we are deviating maybe a little bit from this very pragmatical or guideline approach that you mentioned, but it's only natural to ask, why are we proposing this, and why does this make sense for you to get into this? I mean, what can you eventually gain? So if we can demonstrate through some of the success or some of the application stories, adoption stories that you have been presenting here, that there is indeed some concrete, tangible value into trying to implementing, I think that can be inspiring to the broader community to get interested into them. So this is, I think what we are discussing here is not exactly how to facilitate the implementation, but how to encourage others also to get into implementation by demonstrating that, the value that you get or the benefits in terms of efficiency, simplifications, or many other things, increased cooperation, etc.
So
but-
theoretically, we should be able to, if people apply the model, for example, EOSC, it should have some kind of a mission and vision statement that explains why they do this and what their benefit is.
Yeah, but the mission, the expected outcome is not always exactly the same as the demonstrated benefits. There is a gap. You have an idea, you think it may work, but it's a lot better to show that it works by having put it into practice and by having some tangible, concrete outcomes that you can actually show as a result. So there is a little bit a gap. The mission and vision does not always fully, unfortunately, overlap with what you actually end up getting. So if you're actually guys putting this into practice and seeing already some concrete benefits, the point would be sharing these concrete benefits to the extent possible with the broader community to encourage further adoption. That is a little bit my proposal.
I agree with Javier. It's to some degree, but I think Martin, you raised a good point. Is like we might want to put up boundaries on what the model is trying to accomplish, or what the GORC interest group and working groups, because there will be more than one in the future, actually want to achieve. And I think we definitely want to have the mission to be the adoption and successful implementation of the model and other supporting outputs as they come through. Like that's definitely the one that we want to aim for. In terms of convincing people or showcasing the benefits of why having a commons or cloud infrastructure, just a collaborative research infrastructure space, in terms of, are we trying to talk to the people who haven't made that decision, they want to do that yet, or are we talking to people who have made that decision and are looking for how do they get there, or what do they need to consider to get there? Definitely the latter. For the former, I agree with Javier that we can aspire to do that. I think that inspiration is a good idea. Because we've seen a lot of success with people having national level commons or pan-national level commons like the European Open Science Cloud, the IVOA, the AOSP. Like we've seen lots of examples of where that can be very successful. And showcasing that I think can be inspirational. But I think more so what this is trying to do is to not convince you to make a commons. I think what we should be aiming to say is for those people that see the benefit in collaborative research infrastructure, to showcase why having a global interconnection or global interoperability of these infrastructures, why that is important. So I think we're kind of talking to the people, our primary audience of people who have already decided it's a good idea for their own community, but then convincing them that it's a good idea to make sure that their community is interoperable with the rest of the world too. But I definitely agree with Javier that we can definitely inspire to convince people that having collaborative research infrastructure is a good idea as well. But yeah, scope is important for sure. Just watching the time, we did have a couple other questions. I do want to see if anyone in the audience has any other questions for our adopters before we move into this area of future work, which I might make our last question, the one on the bottom. Does anyone in the audience have questions for our adopters before we move into a discussion on what comes next? I know that Francois has been very, very active in the chat. So Francois, if you have anything that you'd like to raise, I would love to hear it.
Sorry, I don't want to put too much fuss in the discussion. I do it in the chat, so I guess you will copy the chat.
Yeah, we will.
But I think to have a good idea of the kind of profiles of the people who should be involved in each of the boxes of a model when you try to build the model, I think it's a very good idea and it's very important. Because and I also think, yes, that in addition to the value of a model, when people are convinced to set up a GORC, I think it shows them that they are not alone and that there is a starting point. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. Mm-hmm. And I think it is very important because it's frightening when you begin these things and it tells you others have done it and maybe we have a look and it will help us.
I hope that it does help. That's definitely the goal. So thank you, Francois.
Could I expand on that?
Go ahead, Wilmer.
Yeah, so I mean, I think also tying back a little bit to the value proposition, I think, I mean, to some degree, we have successful, I mean, commons-like structures that might want to improve, that could adopt the model as a way of helping them improve. But then you need some incentives or way of motivating the investment. I mean, both in learning the model and then the next step as kind of making the changes that would be necessary for the next step. So, I mean, I think maybe it would be useful to try to identify some intermediary or immediate benefits of adopting the model. And I think what Francois mentioned with just knowing that you're not alone, perhaps having a registry of different commons, and at least at some surface level, describe how those could be used to inspire you on your journey. I mean, regardless if they're completely described using the model or not. And then something that we have been discussing briefly in Elixir is that, I mean, it could be a way of highlighting services that you're offering. I mean, using the model to hinge the different services or registries or resources that you have and make them visible to others to adopt as solutions to those, I mean, or in taking those next steps. So if we could create some sort of listing of commons working together and try to create some sort of piecemeal servings of immediate benefits, that might make it easier to make a case for starting improvement journeys. And maybe we could focus on a certain part of the model to kind of increase the number of examples, or just see if we can find people who would be willing to do a very surface level inventory of their own commons or something like that. So it's not a big investment to take the first step and get this catalyst, so to speak, for motivating people to take the first few steps.
You know, those are all really good suggestions, and motivation is a key part of it. I keep coming back more and more to like this knowledge graph idea where maybe we would have not just a list, but also showcasing like what people are doing. We did hear in our speaker series that there were a couple of commons that were already working together and had memorandums of understanding, and they were already seeing some benefit there. So I think that we can amplify it with the examples we already know and then gain more as we go through. I think those are some, yeah, we'll think more about that, Fulmar, for sure, and how we can implement it and get that started. So I think we're gonna move into an open discussion in our last 10 minutes. We do have the interest group, and we've kind of already been talking about what comes next. Like we've talked about profiles, we've talked about making mission and vision statements, value propositions. So some of this is already what we've talked about, but making more specific, the interest group is still active and they're working on the integration roadmap. That's their goal. The International Model Working Group will become the International Implementation Working Group, which is also GORC 2, because I had to go for that, of course. And there's a ton of possible avenues of work, which you saw rated in the Menti. But one I think that we can start with first, and we're going to hear Rory talk about it briefly, is mapping with relevant frameworks, and more specifically with some RDA outputs that are really, really pertinent. And so, Rory, I have your slides already loaded in here, but you're welcome to share your own screen, whatever you think is easier.
Well, why don't you go for it, CJ? That's probably quicker, if you don't mind.
All right.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to briefly talk about the what oddly perhaps named the Meldrith map, but it's a working group which is just this month completing our work, developing a map of the digital research tools landscape. So this was it was one of two groups that were supported by Oracle for Research. And we've already had both of our sessions, and the video recordings of the sessions are up if anyone's interested. So there were 3 deliverables in what we tried to do, or what we've done. And in order to come up with a map of tools used in the research lifecycle. So first we did a review of existing models out there of the research data lifecycle, of which there are probably more than 100. We started with 26 and then tried to look at them, what were their commonalities, what ones were useful, what were not, and came up with 5, which we thought were quite good and also quite representative. And then we looked at in detail at the 5 and tried to harmonize them and come up with what we call a harmonized model of the research data lifecycle, which is not to say it's better than the others, but at least it's based on a review and analysis of existing models, and it was something we could start with, and that's captured in the graphic at the right. Next slide. So that was really the foundational element. And the second deliverable is, I guess, really what we were trying to achieve, which was for each stage of the research life cycle, and this was done through a series of many meetings, some of which involved different people, many people, dozens of people, possibly several hundred people were involved. It was kind of a collective community brain dump about research tools in the data lifecycle. For each stage, we came up with 3 categories of tools, which were representative of tools used at that stage, in the planning stage or the collection stage or whatever the stage might be. And then for each category of tool, we delved a little bit deeper, and for each category, we had a long list of example tools. And again, we selected 3 tools which were widely in use, representative of each category. So that is the schema. Next slide, please. And then the third deliverable, I can't give you a very nice visualization of because we're still desperately trying to finish it off. But it's basically a visualization, an interactive, it's using open source tools, an interactive visualization of the second slide that I just presented. So that's been our work so far. And then I think the last slide is talking about some thoughts that we have we're going to create hopefully create a follow-up working group to continue the work. And the plans for the group are first to continue developing the model and to work on for example, one of the things we want to do is to develop some attributes for each of the example tools. For example, are they open source or closed sourced? Are they interoperable? We also are going to be exploring various sustainability options. And perhaps most important, I think, and certainly most relevant to our discussion today, because there's significant connectivity, let's say, with the tools and services element of the GORC model. And in fact, we've already had multiple discussions with CJ in particular. And at the session we had yesterday, CJ's actually already done a mapping between the model, the Maldoror model, and the tools and elements the tools and services element of the GORC model. So we think that there's extensive scope for a joint venture, collaboration, trying to see as the GORC moves forward with its development, and as the Maldoror model develops, how these two, especially the tools and elements element of the GORC and the Maldoror model, can come together, possibly in a single thing, or if not, at least working together. And we think there's scope for the two models to continue to inform each other as both continue to develop. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Rory. And so there's also been discussion throughout some of the other sessions. So the main one with the Maldoror model, which we have done some mapping back and forth with, but then there's also been discussion with the National Data Services. Well, currently a Birds with Feathers session likely will become an interest group again. And you saw Francois mentioning it in the chat too, that there's collaborative work that we can do with these two groups, as well as work that we can do with the Life Science Data Infrastructures Interest Group. Walmart, I hope I didn't butcher that too badly. that can either be joint ventures or it can be its whole new working group, which is something we've got in the works too. But in terms of where we actually move next with the GORC International Implementation Working Group, there's lots of things that we can do with other groups, and some of them are going to fall into some of these things. So what I'd like to open the last few minutes for is thinking about what we should try and do next. So there's model revisions, which was brought up with our adopters in some of the early things around rewording and item cleanup, because not all of the items had the same level of detail or the same wording around them. Continuing with adoption support and feedback, which I think is where this value statement and value proposition would go. I think it would fall under that adoption support and feedback, as well as creating like an adoption starter kit, where we've got some of those benefits laid out, but then also maybe examples provided. Additional analysis and publications from the version 1. That's the commons types, which will help inform the types of profiles that we can create. The speaker series analysis, which I've hinted at, showcases the implementation or examples of things. And then cross-cutting themes was another piece of work that we kind of left on the cutting room floor. Mapping with relevant frameworks, that's what we just heard about. Visualization and graphics, we've already got this started. RDA Tiger is interested in helping us with this again, and we've got some great ideas from Rory's group working on the Muldroth model and their visualization, as well as from NIST with their RDAF visualization. They've agreed to give us some pointers as well. There's always the idea of more versions, wider landscape review, more literature review, research hardware, physical tools and samples. And I'm thinking about Francoise in particular, as well as Volmar, regarding, say, telescopes and say sample analyses like NMR or SEM. Implementation maps, how do you do it? Maturity model and others. And so this kind of links back to our Menti. I see that it did actually shift a little bit. Adoption, support, and feedback still being the top makes sense to me. Implementation map, maturity models, visualizations, that all sounds meaningful. Model revisions is 8th, which is interesting because we're not interested in making any intermediate versions, I guess. But we'll need to think about that more. So we are running out of time. Does anyone want to voice a particular, I don't know, wish to see a particular one move forward? Or do we think the discussion we've had so far has kind of highlighted that we need to keep working on adoption, support, and feedback? Maybe diving into this analysis more, especially our commons types and speaker series, mapping with relevant frameworks, and visualizations and graphics, I feel is almost a separate thing because RDA Tiger has agreed to help us take that external. So that one might be a low-hanging fruit as well.
Yes, there is what remains is the question about the typology of do you try, does one try to establish a typology of the GORCs, or at least a few categories which could help adopters when they are not far from one of those categories?
Do you mean the commons types?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so we do have, okay, let me walk back. I made a set of types that have not been vetted with the community or tested with our speakers, but I tried when we were doing the analysis and the speaker series analysis to identify a 4-dimensional commons type, I guess, tensor, if you will, for each of our speakers. And so that included the dimensions of scope, so regional, national, pan-national. It included whether they were discipline specific or discipline agnostic. It included their scale, so were they largely volunteer driven, or were they or did they have a really large staff that they were supporting? So that kind of linked into funding. And the last one was about their scope of services. So were they offering a lot of intensive services, everything was in-house, or were they contracting a lot with external service providers, which were already well known in the community? And I'm giving a very light overview. There's actually a lot written down in our draft document. Like for those that were in the group, you might recall it as the Martyr document. There's pages and pages of explanation and motivation for why I chose those dimensions, but it's up for discussion. So short answer to your question, Francoise, yes, there was some thought on it, but we haven't actually brought it up in the working group yet for further discussion and refinement. So definitely worth thinking about more. And just noting that we are out of time, I'll finish with the next steps and wrap up. These BOF sessions are over. So please check out the recordings for the sessions for the Health Data Commons Gork Profile Working Group as well, that happened in breakouts 1 and 10. And if you're interested in hearing updates on the Gork group, I'll email everyone who signed up in the collaborative notes, but we'll also be sending out updates through the interest group and international model working group while we're getting the next working groups up and running. So thank you so much for everyone who joined today. If you've got further questions or ideas, please put them in the collaborative notes. I'll try and follow up with you if I can. You're also welcome to email me, Javier, and Andrew Trillar directly. We're the 3 active co-chairs at this time.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for the very good discussion and for all your contributions. Looking forward to continuing them in the future. So, CJ, I guess this was the closing of the session, right?
Yeah, no, we are officially past the end of the session. Thank you to all of our adopters too for being here and making time to attend. I really, really appreciate you guys being here and being part of that panel discussion, which kind of turned into like, what are we going to do next discussion, which I feel is like is how a lot of these adoption discussions go, which is perfect. So thank you again. I'm hoping that we'll follow up with each of you as a group or individually on some of the ideas that have been brought up today, as well as how we can further support you. And yeah, please feel free to reach out at any point as well, but we're here to help. We're also in the process of onboarding new co-chairs. So we're hoping to have them come in and help us with adoption too. So we're just kind of in this transition stage with the group, but we'll follow up eventually, probably over the next month.
Thank you for hosting the session.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Looking forward to keep following the work.
Yeah, thanks.
And
thanks, CJ.
contributing, of course.
And contributing,
Goodbye.
yeah, you better.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you,
bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye, thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye.